Everything you think you know about resolving conflict in relationships might be incomplete. We've been told that the solution is simple: communicate better, explain yourself clearly, use logic, make your point. But here's the problem: when emotions are activated, the brain is not looking for logic, it is looking for safety. And the moment your nervous system senses threat, whether real or perceived, the body reacts before your mind even finishes the sentence. Your chest tightens, your breath shortens, your shoulders tense, your jaws lock. And suddenly, the conversation is not about connection anymore. It becomes a verbal conflict. In this episode, I want to talk about why that happens, what your body is actually telling you in those moments, and how conflict can shift from a fight to something much more powerful, a portal to deeper intimacy. Stay tuned, we're going to dig in. Welcome to the Secret Formula of Femininity for women who want to live a more feminine, fun, and fabulous life. I'm Dr. Nicole Monteiro, your host on this weekly journey to unlocking your inner radiance, nurturing fulfilling relationships, and becoming the best version of yourself. Welcome back, everybody, to the Secret Formula of Femininity. I'm Dr. Nicole, your host and guide on this journey to tapping into your feminine essence. And today I'm going to talk about the trap of verbal combat. Let's start with something that almost everyone has experienced. You're in the middle of a disagreement with your partner. Maybe they misunderstood something you said. Maybe you feel criticized. Maybe they raised their voice slightly or used a tone that landed wrong with you. And almost instantly, your mind begins rehearsing a defense. You start building arguments in your head. Let me explain what I meant. That's not what happened. You're twisting my words. You do the same thing. This is not random. This is your brain doing exactly what it was designed to do: protect you from threat. The moment we feel misunderstood or attacked, our nervous system shifts into a defensive posture. And in that moment, communication stops being about understanding. It becomes about self-protection. Now add something very modern to this dynamic: the dating landscape that we live in today. Rapid fire texting, ambiguous messages, read receipts but no response, delayed responses, read receipts and delayed responses, ghosting. All of these experiences subtly train the nervous system to remain on high alert. Many people are walking into relationships already carrying a heightened sensitivity to being rejected or misunderstood. So when tension appears, even if it's a small bit, the body interprets it as something much larger. And what happens next is actually fascinating. You may actually win the argument logically, but while you're winning the logic battle, something else is happening underneath the surface. You're losing the emotional connection. And that's the irony, because relationships don't thrive on who wins the argument. They thrive on who can restore safety the fastest. How can you repair? I want you to let that land. Relationships thrive on who can restore safety the fastest, or how you all can repair. So let's try to decode your body's alarm system. Before most arguments even begin, the body has already started speaking. The problem is that most of us were never taught how to listen to those messages. Conflict often begins with a physical sensation long before the first voice is raised. You might notice something like a tightening in your chest, shallow breathing, heat rising in your face, cold hands, a clenched jaw. These are not random sensations. They are actually biological signals from your nervous system saying something feels threatening. But there is a key distinction. A perceived threat is not the same thing as an actual threat. However, your body cannot always distinguish between your emotional discomfort and real danger. That's why we say emotions are real, and developing emotional intelligence is a skill that will save you in so many areas in your life. So when your partner says something that feels critical or rejecting, The nervous system may react the same way it would as if a car suddenly swerved toward you. That's why the logical explanations often fail during conflict. It's because the nervous system is not looking for logic, it's scanning for regulation and safety. This means that the real skill in relationships is not learning how to argue better, it's learning how to notice what your body is doing before the argument takes over. So instead of focusing only on the story in your mind, such as what they meant, what they did wrong, what you need to say back, you need to begin asking a different question. What is happening in my body right now? That shift alone changes everything in how you handle conflict. One thing I had to learn is that my body senses things before my mind or any logic comes into play. And that's a beautiful thing. It's just learning how to observe that, perceive it, and notice it. And then it becomes a superpower. One of the most powerful tools for helping to interpret conflict is something that's really simple. It's the somatic pause. And if you've been listening to me for any amount of time, you know I love pauses. I think we're quick to react, and that can cause so many problems. We're just taking a little bit of time to pause before you do anything can save you so much heartache. You can think of the somatic pause as a 5-second reset. So when you feel the tension rising in your body, when your chest tightens or your breathing speeds up, or you get that feeling in the knot in the pit of your stomach, pause. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It's not performative where you're like, hey, I'm pausing. It's just long enough to shift your attention downward, out of the mind and into your body. You can feel the area around the solar plexus. Notice your breath. Notice your shoulders begin to soften. Maybe even adjust your posture or shift your weight on your feet if you're standing. These are small micro movements that send signals to your nervous system. They say, you are safe enough to slow down. That moment of perceiving safety interrupts that automatic reaction loop where you had a story in your head, you had a reaction in your body, and you were ready to fight or flee. So instead of escalating the conversation, you're able to create space. I cannot tell you how powerful this is. I'm telling you from my own experience and from what I've observed in the women that I've worked with. And in that space, something powerful becomes possible. You are able to respond, not react. And this is where emotional maturity actually lives. I think we're all going for that emotional maturity, right? It's not in having the perfect words, but it's in being able to regulate yourself. But it's in being able to regulate yourself before you speak the words. So let's talk about how to communicate from the ground up. Once you have been able to ground yourself with that pause, the way you are able to communicate totally changes. Most arguments, if you think about it, begin with accusations. You always do this. You never listen. You're overreacting. You're twisting what I said. These statements immediately trigger what? Defensiveness. So instead, you can try something radically different. Name the physical experience that's happening in your body, not the story. The story has all kinds of interpretations. The physical experience is just you noticing and naming, noticing the sensation and naming it. So, for example, you could say to yourself, my chest feels really tight right now. My throat feels constricted. I'm noticing my breathing getting shallow. This kind of communication bypasses the defensive barriers that the other person may have up. It's because you're no longer attacking them, you're just naming what's happening. You're revealing yourself, which takes vulnerability and it signals safety to the other person. And that creates a different type of emotional environment within the conversation. So instead of two people fighting over who is right, something completely different happens. The nervous system in the room begins to synchronize. You're mirroring each other. Softening becomes contagious, and the fight or flight energy starts to settle down. What you're doing in that moment is inviting your partner into a shared physical space, a space where both people can slow down enough to reconnect, where both people can start to let down their defenses and be willing to have that vulnerability to connect. So, if you think about it, conflict can be seen as a portal to intimacy. Here's the shift that I want you to consider. What if the goal of conflict isn't actually to solve the original problem? What if the deeper goal is to resolve the physical sensation between you? Because here's the thing, once the nervous systems settle, the actual issue often becomes much easier to discuss. Couples who build somatic awareness over time begin to experience conflict completely differently. And this is regardless of the way that they grew up, how conflict and disagreement were handled in their household, they can shift the narrative. Disagreements still happen, of course, but they will feel less threatening. And that's usually the part from our own attachment and family history that we're bringing to these interactions. They become less catastrophic and more manageable. And something surprising will then emerge that you didn't expect. That is intimacy. Because every time two people navigate tension together and come back to being regulated, they reinforce a shared sense of safety with each other. Over time, that safety becomes the foundation of the relationship. Conflict stops being a sign that something is wrong, and instead it becomes a signal that something important is asking for attention. Two people are no longer arguing against each other, they're navigating a shared physiological experience together. And that shift changes everything. It makes it possible to enact all of the different advice you may be hearing about. I often talk about the research of the Gottmans, that it's the small things that couples do to be present for each other, to lean in and observe, make bids for reconnection, and to observe their partner's bid for reconnection, to be able to be kind in spite of differences or disagreements. And all of that sounds great, but many people miss the foundation of how to do that. It's by using it's by using that somatic pause, learning to respond instead of react, and signaling to your partner that it's okay for them to let their defenses down too. Before we close, I want to share an example of how this plays out in a way that may be very familiar to some of you. There was a woman in my coaching program who described herself as extremely independent. She said it with pride, with her chest out. She was successful, capable, and of course, very self sufficient. She was the kind of person that people often say she has it all together. But when conflict came up in her relationship, she didn't argue. She instead disappeared. It wasn't a physical disappearance, but emotionally she disappeared. Her partner would bring up an issue and she would suddenly go quiet, like nothing. She would cross her arms, give short answers, and eventually say something like, "It's fine, let's drop it." From the outside, it looked calm, but inside, her body was doing something very different. When we slowed these moments down, she realized that right before she shut down, which she didn't know initially she was shutting down, she felt a heavy pressure in her chest and the sinking sensation in her stomach. When we slowed those moments down, she realized that right before she shut down, she felt a heavy pressure in her chest and this sinking sensation in her stomach. Her breath would get shallow and her shoulders would pull inward. She did such a great job of showing us what it looked like. What her nervous system had learned over many years was that conflict is not safe. The safest move is withdrawal. So it's really like the freeze response when we say fight, flight, or freeze. So instead of fighting, her body protected her by disconnecting. And the challenge with shutdown is that it often leaves the other person feeling abandoned or confused. And it can go into one of those four horsemen that Gottman talks about, which is stonewalling. And that's how you communicate your displeasure to your partner. So, what we did with her is practice something very new to her. The next time tension came up, instead of shutting down completely, I asked her to practice pausing and saying something simple. So she learned to practice saying, "Something is happening in my body right now. I feel myself starting to shut down." Let me tell you, the first time she said that, she said her partner couldn't believe it. That sentence alone really changed the dynamic because instead of disappearing, she stayed present just enough to name what was happening. And her partner suddenly understood that the silence wasn't indifference, so he didn't have to feel rejected or abandoned. The silence was protection for her. And from there, they could slow down together. So, what used to feel like emotional distance started to become moments of shared awareness between both of them. That is the power of noticing the body and what's happening in the body before these patterns take over. Sometimes the most courageous thing we can do in conflict isn't to argue harder, be more logical. It's simply to stay present long enough to say, "This is what my body is feeling right now." And that can be more powerful and more freeing than you could ever imagine. And this technique can be used no matter what your style is. I've worked with a lot of over explainers. This is the woman who talks more and more when she feels insecure and conflict. And so her response feels very anxious, and she also needs to reconnect to her body. I want to leave you with this. The biggest mistake many of us make in relationships is believing that words alone will resolve the tension. And nobody can blame us because this is what we've been taught, especially women. We were taught to be verbal and articulate and use our words. But the body speaks before the mind does. And when we learn to listen to those signals, to the breath, to the chest, to the tension that's throughout our body, we end up opening the door to a different kind of communication, one that begins with regulating ourselves and co regulating with our partner. And from there, connection becomes possible again. So, conflict, if you think of it like that, stops being something that we have to avoid, which that becomes a dangerous thing, always avoiding conflict. Instead, it becomes an invitation to slow down, to feel, and to build a deeper kind of safety with the person who's in front of you. A safety that only builds on itself and lasts and creates emotional intimacy. If this conversation and these techniques resonate with you, this is the exact work that we do inside the Boundaries to Bliss Society inner circle. This is where we focus not only on boundaries and communication, but the deeper skill of nervous system awareness and emotional regulation in relationships. Because the bottom line is, when your body feels safe, everything else becomes easier to navigate. And it becomes much more enjoyable for you to lean into your feminine energy. Thank you all so much for joining. Don't forget to share, hit subscribe, and leave us a comment or a review. I want to hear exactly what resonated with you from this episode. Until next time, stay soft, stay regulated, stay feminine. I'm Dr. Nicole.